I'm here today with Brad Kelly. He is one half of the Art of Darkness podcast. People who have listened to podcasts I've done in the past have probably heard Brad and I speak in the past. He came on to New Right last year. We did a great episode, and of course, even more recently than that, I came. This was, I guess, in February. I came on a Dark Room episode of Art of Darkness podcast with you and Kevin Kautzman, and we talked about William S. Burroughs and his charmed worldview. I think we'll get a little bit back into that today, at least briefly. But Brad is also a writer of a number of things. You wrote a novel called House of Sleep, which people should check out if they have not already. I know you're writing a new novel now, which I may bug you for details on later. But you also kind of write just generally, and one of the things you have written about and thought about a lot is tarot, which is why I brought you on today. Your website has a fantastic little section where you give in-depth personal reflections on 10 or so of the different tarot cards. I had read those in the past. I enjoyed kind of looking over them in the lead up to this podcast, and I may ask you about some specifics later. But I guess the first question I was going to ask you is how you got into tarot, and maybe it actually makes sense for me to keep rambling a little bit and start by saying how I got into tarot. Now, anyone who's listened to the shows we've done in the past has heard me say that you, Brad, in fact, got me into tarot, which is this funny thing. You sent me a copy of House of Sleep with a tarot card in it, almost like a bookmark, and I was very unfamiliar with tarot beforehand. I knew what the cards were, but and I had an interest in esoteric and occult subjects, so I was open to them, for better or worse. But I had never really seen a proper card. I pulled the Four of Pentacles out. I believe it was reversed. If you know, some people believe in that. Some people, so some people look into the reversal. Some people do not. But for whatever it's worth, I do think it was reversed. I later had you interpret it for me on a later podcast, and that sort of whet my appetite for it. And about a year ago, almost to the date, I think it was April 15th of 2022, I bought my first Rider Waite deck, and my interest has been growing substantially since then, to the point that I'm now, and I'll talk more about this later, that I'm now actually writing a Substack post every day about a different tarot card. I'm also on TikTok pulling a different tarot card every day, writing about it on Substack. It's influenced my creative process in some pretty profound ways. So that's my opening monologue. But that is, I guess it does all give some context for why I wanted to have you on.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so yeah, I'm sorry or you're welcome, I guess, for for sending you down that path. That's really cool. Thanks for having me on it. And thanks for having that conversation we had back on New Right a while ago. Yeah, it's a it's a rabbit hole, and I've been kind of dipped back into, as this conversation, we were leading up to this conversation, I dipped into your tarot ratings, and I was impressed. And I'm just like, wow, he really went deep. He's gone deep on this.
Yeah,
very impressive. So
thank you.
Yeah.
No, I try to go deep. I'm the type of, I sense that you're similar. I sense that a lot of people who follow me online are similar. I never, go into anything halfway. Of course, the issue with tarot is if you go in the whole way, you really never hit the bottom.
It is infinite in there. Yeah, the rabbit hole opens up into a cavern that is as as big as the Akashic record or something. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely, and trying to write about these cards every day, I think it brings out both a very bad tendency in my writing, but also one that I kind of enjoy, and like maybe in the end, it's kind of just my thing, which is that, again, yes, I do try and get into these things deeply. But when you're dealing with tarot, it's like all of a sudden, I feel like I can't begin to write about this card until I've at least done a cursory overview of Kabbalah or alchemy. I'm kind of stuck right now. I use the Thoth Crowley deck, and he delineates a connection between an alchemical sort of symbolic connection between Trump 2, the Lovers, and Trump 14, or rather, is it Trump 2 or 3? I think it's 2. No, it's three. I should know that off the top of my head. Anyway, between that and Trump 14, which he calls art, called Temperance in Former Decks. I won't get into it here. I'll be
Yeah.
writing about it on Substack soon.
Okay.
But you know, I get into this, and all of a sudden, I'm writing all about the different phases of the great work, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, through this alchemy stuff, and it's very exciting. But now I'm like, I haven't actually posted in a few days, even though I was trying to do it every day because I'm so hung up on trying to get all of these details. The way you approach tarot on your site is a little different and probably in certain ways better. I mean, I view my project there as I'm just trying to take as many notes and trying to get to the heart of the matter as possible. I don't think it's necessarily the best writing. It's kind of more like a public note taking, which I kind of like. But the your reflections was kind of more what I had in mind when I started, and what hopefully I'll be getting to after I've gotten some of the bigger topics out of the way, which is very, very personal, creative, almost like not auto fiction, but like very creative nonfiction reflections on the cards.
Yeah. No, it's so when we could talk about, I guess, distinctions between your approach to it and my approach to it, at least in terms of writing. I was inspired to do the pieces I've been doing on the tarot, and they're like 3 to 5 page. I don't even know what to call them. I mean, I was referring to them as essays, and somebody told me that somebody who liked them was like, these are not essays. I don't know what they are, but they're not essays.
Yeah.
I was inspired by for a while, and I think it was the Paris Review, the poet Sabrina Ora Mark was writing these things about fairy tales, and they were quite good. But they're similar to what I'm doing in the tarot, and I'm sort of inspired by her, so it's no surprise. But she's talking about what the fairy tale is, but she's kind of blending it into her own life, what it means to her, and they end up being these sort of refractions that the pieces that I'm writing about the tarot, if you're trying to learn how to do a reading or learn what the cards mean, these are probably not the first place to go if that's what your goal is. You're not gonna but they do reflect me thinking quite a lot about each one of these cards, and reflect all the things that I've learned about the symbolism and the correspondences along the way. So they're all kind of baked in there, and I might have a little paragraph about some scientific concept. I might have a paragraph about something that happens to me. I might have a paragraph about the Kabbalah, or numerology, or whatever seems to make sense. And the idea is eventually I'm going to write a piece about every card in the deck. It'll probably take me another decade or so at the current rate, but that's okay, because to me, it's gonna take me my whole life to figure this thing out anyway, and so it's kind of okay. It'll be interesting to see 7 or 8 years from now what those pieces look like as compared to this sort of first round of them, for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm starting this process going through the deck. I'm very ambitiously trying to do a card a day, which is kind of wreak havoc on my life. Although I still kind of want to try and keep to it. I just have to figure out a way to do it in a more streamlined manner. But I view this very much as a round one learning. I mean, I'm not saying that my writings on them are a great source for learning how to read and interpret, but I'm definitely going for that general approach, like what is going on in this card symbolically, and like what does Crowley say, what do other people say, and looping in my personal experience in a similar way that you do where I can. But it's often kind of devolved because I do think on the one hand this is like a bad tendency of my writing to get overly analytical. On the other hand, it's like it's what I'm doing, you got
to play to your strengths, right?
Got to play to my strengths, and it's a bit of these posts are kind of like sprawling frescoes right now of different things, which I like.
Yeah, I quite like them, and I just want to reiterate, I really like the project you're doing. I'm sure trying to do one of those a day is a monumental task. And I do appreciate the open, because a lot of times, early in my tarot days, I would kind of prowl the internet looking for what people had said about this card. And usually you land on a site that's sort of like, this is what the card means. And it's, some little paragraph, and you're like, well, there's more to it than that. It's not just that.
Well, I like how you brought up the fairy tale thing. I've been thinking about that in regard to the cards a lot. they're kind of like, the old superstitious slash negative view on them. They're called the devil's picture book, right? And I
Mhm.
don't necessarily agree with the devil's part, but I do think they're kind of like a picture book for adults, no, for children too, perhaps, but for they're a picture book which contains everything is kind
Yeah.
of the idea. And I think that fairy tales actually operate in a similar way. They're meant to be these distillations in an aesthetic and a pleasurable form, that contain really important lessons for children often, but often that also extend through adulthood. And I really, we're just kind of paying compliments to each other's approach. I really respect and admire what you've done with that. I think that's what a big part of what one is. I think you approach the day, as you said, it's the process of a lifetime. It is important to learn sort of do the philosophical research, shall we say, on the different meaning of the different symbolisms, but also getting as personally connected to the card as you can is only going to
Mhm.
help you, even if you're reading it for other people. And that's kind of how I see your project. And I really admire the degree to which you delve into serious existential matters of your life.
Yeah, well,
In
yeah,
this
well,
card.
thanks for that. Yeah, there a lot of people will sort of tell you, I think, when you start digging into the tarot, it's like just look at the card and go on your feet, what it feels like. Um, and I think there is some virtue to that, but like you do need, there's so much has been thought and so much ink has been spilled about these cards that to like ignore all of that is to do yourself a disservice, I think. I mean, you kind of have to marry the two because if you're just going on your feelings, you're not going to know what that bird means or whatever the little,
Right.
the smaller symbols. But then again, if you're not relating to it personally, the only understanding of the tarot that has any value to you is your own understanding. And so if you're not having some kind of personal relationship with this stuff, then it's never really going to make sense to you, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of the magical process of learning about this is what turns it into something like a practice rather than
Hobby.
just a yeah, a
Yeah.
hobby or an academic investigation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've looked into many things academically, but I don't have much of a personal relation. They don't mean anything to me in terms of how I go about my life. They're just interesting, and that's a certain value of its own. But the tarot sits in a different place in my life for sure.
Yeah. No. Well, I guess I'll just back up a step
Mhm.
and ask, how did you first get into all this with
Sure.
tarot
Yeah,
and
no,
related topics? Yeah.
yeah, that's a good question. So, I it's interesting, just like asking anything in the tarot. It's like, okay, where do you even start with that? So I was raised Catholic, but was always
Yeah.
kind of alienated from that belief system. And your relationship to it evolves and matures over time. And so I'm not as disposed against it as I once was by any
Hmm.
means. I have a
Yeah.
great respect for it. But I think what happens with a lot of people who are raised Catholic is and have that alienated experience, it's like there's some ineffable appeal to mysticism and aesthetics and you kind of
Yeah.
in symbology and you kind of know there's something there and you spend years trying to and sometimes that just ends up back at the church, right? But you spend years trying to find why that is meaningful to you. And for me, the tarot I the tarot came along much later after that, much later in that sort of searching process. And it really was I was just on a date with this girl who read
Yeah.
tarot and
Right.
she wanted to read my cards and I was like, okay, that's cool. That's something that we can talk about. It'll be interesting,
Yeah.
and hey, maybe it's cool. I don't know. I didn't know anything about it. Um, and she gave me a tarot reading and I had goosebumps afterwards and I felt like extremely vulnerable and sort of seen and like it resonated with me intensely.
Yeah.
And then for a while it was just she would just we dated for a while and she would just give me a reading every so often. And I didn't really make much more of it than that. And then um I kind of hit a point that was when I was in graduate school getting my MFA, and then after I got my MFA, I was sort of let loose upon the world, and I had a dissolute couple of years. And in those couple of years, um, I somehow just decided that I needed to understand what this was. Like, I realized that I had missed getting readings from her and was like, well, I could probably figure out how to do that, right?
Yeah,
Like, it's
yeah.
not, I'm a reasonably smart guy. I'm sure I could spend some time and figure this out. And in a bookstore near me, I got a copy of just the only tarot book they had, which was Robert Wang's The Jungian Tarot.
That's probably,
Uh
I haven't read that, but I imagine if
yeah,
it's young, it's serious, so that's good.
yeah, and
Yeah,
it's remained, there's multiple schools of this of tarot,
yeah,
like like martial arts disciplines, and I guess I follow in a lot of ways the Jungian route.
yeah. It
Um,
seems to be the right one.
yeah,
Yeah,
and that book blew my mind, and then I just decided that okay, I need to figure out a programmatic way to get as much of this information into my head as I can. And that was a combination of reading stuff like Robert Wang's work, and then also just
using the cards. Yeah.
learntarot.com. Just
Oh, that's the
you know,
website. Yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it's very intro level. It's very 101. And if you are, you know, it's a great place to start, but don't stop there, is I guess my
Yeah,
advice.
that makes sense. I think with a lot of these things, I mean, there's always like a very you can find a million sites that have the one paragraph long, this card is good, this card is bad type
Hmm.
explanation. And
Hmm.
I don't think those explanations are bad to learn. You kind of just always
Hmm.
have to you start there, don't stop there.
Yeah.
I think as you kind of said earlier, and this is I think one of the things that I was going to say and then forgot. I think it's you got to learn the rules to forget them, Miles Davis kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm as anyone you must if you're into this stuff, you must be a believer in like, oh, there has to be a personal relation with the card. You have to reflect on it personally. But like, I think there's a lot of value in putting the knowledge in your head and then just letting it rip when you're
Hmm.
actually looking at the cards. And then the knowledge that's going to be relevant existentially and personally is going to be there for you. And if it's not, and there's kind of more wild and freewheeling interpretations, those are going to be there too. So I think reading just kind of everything on it. I do think there's different schools of thought, but and that people are going to gravitate towards one or the other. A lot of the more academically serious people are probably going to drift Jungian on it.
Hmm.
But you can kind of I think by their very nature, the decks are syncretic. They especially like so I'm using the Crowley deck, which is very very much brings together symbolism from different traditions. But even the weight deck, there's
Oh yeah.
letters. There's obviously a lot of Christian imagery,
Hmm.
and references to antiquity and gods and goddesses and angels. So
Yeah, there's a
it's yeah.
yeah, the network of references is kind of endless. I mean, yeah, the Kabbalistic stuff was my understanding of the history of the development of tarot was kind of added late in the game in a way. But
Right.
that
No,
makes
that's
it
true. Yeah.
yeah, and that makes it sound like it's somehow not genuine or something. But I think what really happened is the cards were around, and then they came across the table of some very brilliant men, Eliphas Levi
Right.
and A.E. Waite, and they understood that the tarot, the Kabbalah was somehow already in the cards.
That's the
Um,
belief.
mhm,
Well, there's two. It's worth getting. I just saw a great talk here in Los Angeles about the history of tarot, and
mm,
there's obviously a very long version of it, and but you can kind of shorten it, and maybe it's worth presenting here. Basically these were cards that were used by gypsies in Europe for
mm,
centuries for fortune telling
mhm,
as well as for games.
mhm.
And that was pretty much just what they were for centuries. No one really knew where they came from. And then eventually I think two important things happened. One, following Napoleon's invasion of or occupation or whatever it's called, of Egypt, and the kind of the birth of Egyptology in France. Um, so it's basically what happens. I can't the years aren't there for me off the top of my head. What
Mhm.
or I guess late 1700s, early 1800s.
Yeah,
Two things
late
happen.
1700s was
Yeah,
when Court de Gebelin was like, these are ancient Egyptian wisdom.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so that has always been unverified to say the least, whether or not they actually root back to ancient Egypt. But there is kind
Hmm.
of something ethnic going there. Gypsies were always, Romanians rumored to have Egyptian roots. So who
Mhm.
knows? I haven't seen the proof there, but that's one important idea that comes
Mhm.
about. These are rooted to Egypt. And then when we get to Crowley, these were symbols given to us by Thoth himself,
Right.
which we could talk
Right.
about. But whether that's literally true or just an important sort of mythological, basis to delve even deeper into the cards is one thing. But a similar
Mhm.
thing happens with Kabbalah and Eliphas Levi, as you mentioned, where he, again, the real origins of this are somewhat shrouded, but the basic notion is he, and then later Wade as well, realized this, what's the word, synchronicity between the Kabbalah and the tarot, and basically what that synchronicity is, as far as I can understand it, is that the tarot deck is almost like two decks of cards together. There's 22 trumps and however many of the small cards,
Mhm.
and the basic orientation is
56, I guess.
56. I get usually
Yeah.
56. Sometimes there's some
Yeah.
variation.
Yeah.
That the 22 trump cards correspond to the 22 Hebrew letters, the 22 paths on the Kabbalistic tree of life, and then that the small cards in groups of 10 correspond to the 10 Sephira on the tree of
Mhm.
life.
Right.
This, and I'm sure there's other other synchronicities that people would point to, but from this you can develop an entire method of reading the entire pack, which seems to make a lot of sense in a weird way. So even if it
Mhm.
is, is it something that was just kind of added post hoc, or is it some real spiritual basis that's always been there as part of the cards? They both root back to ancient Egyptian
Right.
mysticism, perhaps.
Right.
There's all these unknown questions, but the important thing is that they can work. So sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I tend to think of it as like this evolved system, right? And so you somewhere the wisdom is kind of passed down orally over generations, and then somebody makes a deck of cards and some of that wisdom gets in there, and it literally is it what stays in the deck is stuff that resonates, and what's added to it is something that at least one person felt like was missing. And so there's some kind of way it's like all of the people who have contributed to the tarot have in like a crowd in like the mind of the hive have gradually captured all of this wisdom. So does it go back to ancient Egypt? Well, there probably wasn't something you'd recognize as a tarot deck in ancient Egypt, but I do think that some of the insights developed at that time must survive into the deck because some of them are just true, right?
Right.
So yeah, so it's going to emerge, right?
Right, and that's where I think definitely the occult aspect of tarot, and I mean occult here in the sense of, literally, in the most literal use of the word, this is stuff that has been occulted from
Mhm.
mainstream spirituality, religion, and society. These kind of deeper level senses end up in a deck of cards,
Mhm.
sort of tucked away.
Yeah.
There's that occult aspect to them, but there's also that's where some of the syncretism comes in as well. It's kind of it goes across different traditions, and the symbolism corresponds to deities and ideas that go by different names in different languages and different traditions. But
Mhm.
the tarot is, there's the presence of Hebrew letters, but for the most part is non linguistic, so to
Mhm.
speak. It's pictures, so it crosses those boundaries and picks up significance across cultures. And I think that is a lot of what gives it so much of its power.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. One thing too on the sort of the occulted nature of it, I've thought a lot about because throughout the sort of history of esotericism, there is often what looks like from the outside hoaxes and misattributions and outright frauds. You look at like the Corpus Hermeticum, the Emerald
Mm-hmm.
Tablet, and the works that were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, right? So going back
Yeah.
to the dawn of writing, and then it later turns out that no, these things are actually much more recent. And so there's a way in which that's I think can be levied against by critics, critics of the occult or esotericism as like, well, these things aren't real then. It's all sort
Yeah.
of just made up. It's all sort of flim flam. I am of the opinion that esotericism has to have these so-called frauds, hoaxes,
Yeah.
misattributions, and that's part of how it hides itself. It's like if you're willing to dismiss the whole entire corpus hermeticum because it's not as old as we used to think it is, then you're not really ready to actually digest what's in there. It's a defense mechanism to keep out people who are going to be too narrow-minded and too sort of
Definitely.
tight-lipped
Yeah.
about things.
Yeah. No, I mean, the oldness of things is not of paramount importance.
Not
Obviously,
really.
there's some significance to thinking how long these things go back, but
Mhm.
obviously, at least, even if not tarot decks themselves, even if not the literal emerald tablets, I do think
Yeah.
it's pretty clear that if not all of the ideas, and at least some of these fundamental ideas, do go back within mystical traditions, since for as long as there have been mystical traditions, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, and you see this too. I mean, the fact that the elements are baked in there. I mean,
Hmm.
that is the whole system of elements is a very ancient delivery mechanism for much deeper wisdom than is obvious at the beginning. When you look at it, you're like, oh, they used to think that the world was just made up of air and fire and earth and water. Well, we have science now. It's like that's not really the point of those four
Yeah.
elements, right?
Yeah, the
It's not.
elements meant
Yeah.
something beyond literal,
Hmm.
substances in a chemistry sense, but rather
Hmm.
for sort of attributes of matter, basically, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, it's a means of it's a means to begin sorting the phenomena of reality. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And you bring up these questions of the history of things. I mean, even before bringing tarot in, I've been reading a little bit about the Kabbalah itself, and there's a sense that this may have just been sort of made up at a certain point, or that there's you know that the
Yeah.
history. I think his name was like Rabbi Leon or
Mm,
something.
can't
Anyway,
say.
who is seen as sort of the founder of Kabbalah, and there was a claim. I don't have the proper Hebrew names at my fingertips,
Yeah.
unfortunately, but there was a notion that it went back, to the BC, to BC era,
Right.
basically, but that it may not have, and he may have just kind of made it
Yeah,
up.
and
But there's a sense that it doesn't matter because
it
it's yeah,
it
it's
doesn't
just
matter. I mean, the religions of the world are populated by anomalous visions and insights that whether or not they trace back, before, the Bible is replete with people having visions and insights into things. That's
yeah,
that's how we used to like evolve as a race of people. Was some visionary would have some deep insight into things, and it wasn't about necessarily what books he read or what knowledge was passed down to him, but some experience, right? You're getting back to
yeah.
like the Gnostic, and not talking about Gnostics, but like the actual knowing,
The
the
experience of
actual
knowing,
experience of
and
these
that's the
things. Yeah.
experience of something working in some sense. I think the modern example, and this some people will think this is silly, and this is something that my friend Meme Analysis on YouTube talks about a lot, but I think that the modern example to look at, and it's very instructive, is the notion of meme magic. I mean, we
Mm-hmm.
see memes work, we see memes, not always, but we things like Wall Street bets, and even the Keck Trump thing. We
Mm-hmm.
see memes have their influence. We see memes change people's perception. And like that is clearly real. That it has a real psychological effect, and there really is a deep, one could look at it with Jungian or Freudian eyes, or one could look at it with more explicitly esoteric or magical thinking. But there is a deep level on which these things have their effect. And I would say, of course, they were made up. That's the definition of a
Right.
meme. As there was some
Right.
kid fucking around, and
Right.
people make these things, and maybe they're very, very spiritually attuned and bright people, and they know the kind of effect it could have. Maybe that's the case with Kabbalah,
Mhm.
or maybe they're literally just screwing around, and what they make has a bigger effect than they realize. But nevertheless,
Mhm.
this whole I guess the point I'm trying to make is this whole dichotomy is between like, oh, is it just made up, or is it a real spiritual thing? It's a false dichotomy.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with
It's
that.
all the tarot. The tarot was was kind of like a silly game. Even the fortune telling aspect early on was probably viewed as just a carnival, piece of entertainment. But
Well,
very
and
often there's more to that. Yeah.
yeah, well, and whether let just for playing the devil's advocate,
Yeah.
uh, imagine that God wanted to somehow encapsulate wisdom and hand it off to us somehow. I mean, what better way than a game
Exactly.
to start, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
humans are going to be innately interested in games. They're innately going to want to play with these things. And then over time, what's actually going on starts to sort of leak outside of the game, right? And I'm not even saying necessarily that's what's going on, but I think there's a way of looking at it that way that is quite interesting. If the aliens out there somewhere wanted to start cracking open our hardcore rationalism a little bit, what they might start doing is just sending weird objects into our airspace. And then we go,
Yeah.
what's that thing? Right. And then the
Exactly.
wheels
Yeah.
start turning, right? Rather than like coming down with some like intense, like didactic lesson. It's sort of like the humans are interested in this. Okay. They're going to
Yeah.
keep playing with the idea, they're going to keep evolving it.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like the stone the builders rejected became the cornerstone. What you don't
Mm-hmm.
think matters, whether it's a silly game or whether it's memes, is where
Mm-hmm.
a lot of your most interesting psychic energy is going to hide things in plain sight, is I think
Yeah,
the idea.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Um, I did we'll talk about Kabbalah just a little bit more.
Sure.
Obviously, you kind of told me in the lead up to this that it remains a significant mystery to you as it does to me. That's one of the things I'm trying to delve into with this
Mm-hmm.
Write About a Tarot Card a Day project. But I did want to kind of read a pull quote from one of your reflections on the cards,
Cool.
the Ten of Cups, because I think it kind of does a good job of showing the type of thinking one can get into, with this Kabbalistic, with this tree of life type thinking. And for any listeners who are not familiar with Kabbalah at all or the tree of life, you know, however much you want to go down that rabbit hole is up to you. But if you're not familiar with it at all, it's probably worth Googling, Kabbalah Tree of Life. That's Kabbalah Tree of Life, just to get some sense of what this looks like. Otherwise, it's still going to be abstract, but otherwise, it'll be even more
Yeah.
abstract. But
Right.
what you write about the Ten of Cups is this. The 10th enumerated jewel in the Tree of Life is Malkuth for the Kabbalah. And the first is Kether. Kether is in Malkuth, and Malkuth is in Kether, the kingdom, the earth on which we walk, and the bodies in which we live. Comes from the crown, the divine will itself. The will suffuses the kingdom, and the kingdom is inherent to the will, the inevitable earthen cycle of its emanations, as above, so below. I thought that was really good and kind of, it's not going to make sense to people who don't have any familiarity with this, but there is that kind of Ouroboros nature of the
Mhm.
Kabbalah where the energy, it basically, the way I view it is almost like a pentacle. The Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, sort of tracks um, things in the higher plane becoming manifest in the lower plane. There's that kind of descent from pure spirit into pure matter. That's basically
Mm-hmm.
what it tracks. But as you highlight there, this is kind of a ever moving continuum.
Yeah, it was always, yeah, the state at which it's descending into was sort of always already there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so and the thing is, it's like you'll find in other disciplines in other areas like similar concepts to this. I mean, one of the theories of consciousness now is that basically it's some kind of wave or something that's always out there already,
Yeah.
and it is sort of captured in sufficiently complicated aggregations of matter, right? So it's almost like there's this thing that's out there all the time, and then when the brain gets complicated enough, it starts broadcasting, it starts representing this thing that's always out there already. And
Yeah.
that's not dissimilar from, I think, what the Kabbalah is saying. There's some sort of divine will, something like a consciousness, or that's the best we can do to explain it. That's out there all
Yeah.
the time. And it becomes concrescent more and more and more, and descends into matter until it's the thing that we can actually deal, us stupid
Yeah.
humans can actually deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously there's a lot of things in spiritualism and religion that are kind of dismissed by quote unquote science. But I feel like I haven't really read a lot of people kind of comparing and contrasting science with, comparing and contrasting the Kabbalah with the latest findings in, like, quantum mechanics or
Mhm.
anything like that. But my sense about it, and the way that it's kind of rigorously set up is, if you look at the tree of life, it's not just the tree of life, but above it there's Ein Sof,
Mhm.
there's infinite space slash nothingness, and then below that infinite light, and then everything comes out of infinite light.
Mhm.
Just throwing some big concepts around.
Sure.
Anyway, but these things don't seem that, because you don't even necessarily even bring God too explicitly into it. Well, no, I guess any Kabbalist worth their salt is going to be talking about God, but nevertheless, it's not.
Mhm.
This is not the. I hate to even sound Reddit tier, but this is not the old white guy in the
Right.
sky that
Right.
which I hate to even bring that up, because I hate it when people say, like, oh, I don't believe, it's to
Yeah.
me very Reddit tier and stuff. But this is definitely God in a rather thoroughly thought about mystical sense.
Yeah, it's something to do with the mind, right?
Yeah.
It's what it strikes me is sort of like what we reductively call consciousness, is some maybe diluted or concentrated form of whatever God is, the logos, right? And so it emanates down through these stages that are represented by the tree of life, and made into the world fundamentally.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
And one thing that was kind of interesting for me, starting to understand this, is how this makes perfect sense to me. But I guess if someone's not familiar with the tarot, or not familiar with Kabbalah, this may just sound like more gobbledygook. But one thing that was very instrumental to me in understanding the Kabbalah more, if not thoroughly, was the kind of relation between the different elements and the
Mhm.
Kabbalah, and the different suits in the tarot and the Kabbalah. So
Mhm.
you were talking here about the Ten of Cups,
Mhm.
which is, you even say it's one of those unequivocally positive cards in the entire deck, and I agree with that. The card in the Rider Waite deck anyway shows a family, a joyous family, and a rainbow overhead. I mean, it's very,
Right.
very positive. But the Ten of Swords in a different suit, which most people attribute swords with fire. Sorry, no, most people attribute swords with air. I've
Mhm.
met someone recently attributed them with fire, but anyway, not even getting that.
Yeah.
Um, whereas cups are attributed to water, and there's a sense
Mhm.
that there's certain there's certain elements that in their historical alchemical sign is a downward pointing triangle, water and earth.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
in either of those cases, in the tarot, the tens representing Malkuth, representing the bottom, the total descent from spirit downward to matter. In both the instances of cups and pentacles and earth, they are positive cards. But then with wands and swords, they are negative cards,
Right.
or
Right.
ostensibly negative cards.
Right.
And that was always very interesting to me, to show there's different things going on at the same time. Certain elements become their fullest fruition when they reach the bottom of the tree of life, and others the exact opposite happens.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think a lot about the elemental qualities of each of the suits. And from there, one of the biggest lessons that I remember learning from the tarot fairly early on was the tarot is very wary about uh intelligence, or sort of cogitation, sort of like problem solving in a intelligent, rational way. It's constantly warning you against putting too much stock in your ability to solve problems, which,
Exactly.
yeah, for somebody who kind of came up, as sort of, well, the smarter I get, the more capable I am of doing whatever it is I want, right? So like
Yeah.
putting very high value on just raw IQ intelligence,
Hmm.
and realizing that like, oh, it's not an unalloyed good. It's sort of a tool, and it can and the tarot's telling you this all the time.
Yeah.
The ten of swords is basically,
You
um
overthought things.
yeah,
Yeah.
you overthought things. You're killing yourself by trying to solve all of these problems that don't even exist, so, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so that's one little glint of wisdom that you can get out of the tarot that
Definitely. No,
I
I
find
think,
useful.
yeah, I think when I realized that about the Ten of Swords, it was a major stepping stone for me in understanding the tarot. I was like, I know exactly, in the weight deck, again, as with the Tree of Life, people who are listening to this who may not be as familiar, worth looking all these things up, because, and Brad and I could talk about this
Hmm.
for a while, but like nothing compares to actually looking at the card. And
Hmm.
and that Ten of Swords, in the Rider Waite deck, of the man pierced by 10 swords lying dead on the ground at night. I mean, that's exactly what it feels to me.
Yeah,
Just
that's
sort
one
of
of those. Yeah, that's one of
gutter
those
it. Yeah.
cards where if you are giving a reading to someone who's not super familiar with the tarot, you lay that one out. It doesn't require a ton of explanation for them to
Yeah.
get what the Ten of Swords is about, for sure.
Well, the
So,
one explanation I think I'd give is that these are your thoughts. I'd make sure they
mm,
understood that, because it was like, oh, scare, I'm going to die. It's like, no, you're not
mm,
going to die. It's
all right.
just, this is what it is to think about something so much
Hmm.
that you destroy it.
Hmm.
Yeah, that one always made a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
and I love being able to see and this is part of what when I'm writing about these cards, where I'm trying to see correspondences in sort of different schools of thought, from science to art to everything. And you look at something like that, and I think like, okay, well, we're Homo sapiens, right? We're the thing that we at least think separates us from the rest of the earth is our ability to solve problems and manipulate matter, right? And That's incredibly powerful, as seen by the fact that you and I are talking across the country
Mhm.
simultaneously right now. And yet there's a something that happens that so evolutionarily speaking, you have a sort of problem solving mechanism in your brain. And what we have done in the modern era is we have decided that that is actually us, that's the most salient part of our experience is, or one of them. And then what happens is that thing always needs to be fueled with problems. It was so
Yeah.
keyed in our development as a human being to there used to be thousands of years ago, there never was not a problem to be solved. Right?
Right.
Food, shelter, air, there was never. And so when you come into the modern era, that mechanism can get out of control. And it's like
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
start over engineering the world, right? And you start being a solution looking for a problem. And then you make yourself crazy.
Yeah.
Because
No, this is
sometimes there
definitely me for
aren't
sure.
problems.
Yeah.
you
No, no,
know?
no. And yeah, no, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
something I've sort of suffered from, with a certain low lying anxiety that I'm
Hmm.
trying to work on. And I think tarot is, in a funny way, is one of the things that can kind of help with that. Again, to kind of back up to a previous point, I mean, one of the strengths of it is that it does cross language barriers. It's kind of, by its very definition, in its pictorial nature, it is a extra linguistic, and I think along with that, extra rational. I mean,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
something that's extra linguistic inherently, extra rational. I think we could get in a bit of a Socratic back and forth about that, but I think there's at least
Yeah.
something to be said for that. That
Hmm.
there's this kind of inherent way that it defies what can merely be passed on through language. That's
Yeah.
part of it within the suit of swords. And to clarify, not all swords cards are negative at all.
No.
It's
No.
never, even in this descent down the tree of life thing, it's not as simple. And this is one of the things I got, kind of sidetracked writing about the other day. It's not as simple as, oh, the higher up the swords card, the better; the lower, the worse. It's no. There's, like, most of the sixes are like fairly positive.
Hmm.
It's very nuanced in every step of the way. Although when it gets to Malkuth and does get to the bottom, the tens, that is very clear cut in terms of swords and wands being
Hmm.
cards of a certain oppression, and cups and pentacles being cards of fulfillment. But every other step along the way is totally nuanced, and there's some that are very open for interpretation and others that are more unequivocal. It's as we said at the top of this show, it's a lifetime of stuff to kind of get into.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, and this is, one of the reasons that I lean towards using the Rider-Waite deck is first, it's the one that I guess I've studied the most, but second, like it, especially when you're reading for other people, there's an aspect of it because, and to clarify for people who aren't, familiar with the history here, so before leading up to the Rider-Waite Smith deck, which was developed by A.E. Waite, and the artist Pamela Coleman Smith, the cards generally didn't have figurative illustrations on anything but the major arcana. So if you had a two of swords, it had two swords on it, right? It didn't have an actual, it didn't depict a scene. And what the Rider-Waite Smith deck did, there had been a deck before that, the Solabusca deck, that had figurative illustrations depicting scenes on the pips. But what Rider-Waite Smith did is they kind of formulated all of that in the early 1900s, and a lot of decks have been inspired by that. So a lot of times, if you go and you get the I'm trying to think of the name of it. There's so many decks now. The Feral something deck, the Green Man deck, all these decks. They generally follow the Rider-Waite Smith paradigm. For me, it's been useful because I think of it as the children's illustrated Bible version of the tarot, right? And if you were going to go to somebody, like, let's say you wanted to teach Christianity to somebody who didn't know anything about it. Well, do you start with like the dense theology of a St. Augustine, or do you start and you say, here is Noah and Noah's Ark,
exactly.
right, in a picture? And so for me, you can clearly go much deeper than that. I mean, the most profound book I've read on the tarot is Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, which you can just read. You could just read over and over and over again throughout your life, and maybe you start to understand it.
Is that the one where the subtitle is like a dive into Christian Hermeticism?
Yeah,
is that a different one? Okay,
it's like something Christian exploration.
Christian Hermeticism is mentioned on the cover. Yeah, that's I was gonna ask later, like what books you'd recommend. That's on my list. But keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. So for me, the Rider-Waite Smith deck is like it helped me to have these images because you're also, there's an element of memory palancing when it comes to learning the tarot. You're trying to remember these things, and when you're trying to do readings for other people, you're trying to get to the point where you don't need any references, right? You're just going to read these cards to these people. And so having the images is a clear aid to memory. There's very rarely is there going to be an illustration on the deck that contradicts what the meaning of the card is, right? That's basically, there's going to be depths hidden in there, but you're not going to contradict it. And so for me to do a reading to somebody, they're going to get something off of just looking at the card. And that thing is going to be unarticulated and somewhat superficial, but it's not going to be wrong. And their impression of it is going to be an access point for us to go into what the deeper correspondences of the card. So that's why I like that deck. It's a little whimsical and a little fairy tale looking, and that's fine.
That's goes along with the children's illustrated Bible thing. Yeah, no, like, so I'm using the Thoth deck for my project. I know a lot of people who swear by the Thoth deck, who swear it's the best one, but for me, I feel like you have to have, I don't know. I still feel like the Waite deck sort of is the best one to learn with anyway, because those illustrations are so clear. I mean, the Thoth deck is fantastic. And you and Kevin even talked about this on your Crowley Art of Darkness episode. You know, it's probably the best deck artistically.
Oh, for sure.
And probably the best sort of esoterically as well. But just in terms, especially with the small cards, I find, because Crowley kind of leans away from, and the artist he was working with, Frida Harris. Right. Yeah, the Crowley.
Yeah, right.
They kind of lean away from, Crowley and Frida Harris kind of lean away from having like really explicit scenes sort of drawn out on the small cards. And I think that can be very helpful. But
Yeah, for sure. And you know, a lot of decks, if you look into the uh Alejandro Jodorowsky's psychomagical system of the tarot, I mean, he's very much against having illustration scenes on the small cards. So you know, there's reasonable people can disagree about what should be on those small cards for sure. But you know, to me, it's a little more exoteric to have them on there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, no, just a side note, I've heard about this Jodorowsky deck. There's a place, maybe you even heard of it. There's a place in Los Angeles called the Philosophical Research Society, which is like a library and sort of study center
Mhm.
founded by Manly Palmer Hall.
Oh, okay,
And
cool.
I've
Yeah.
heard, I haven't been to the library there yet. I mean to do so soon, but I heard they have like Jodorowsky's, I think, a deck that he made. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping.
Yeah. So my understanding is he took it's a an improvement on the Marseille deck. So
Yeah.
it's not a complete reinvention of it, but it's he's very keen on the colors of things. I've never seen anybody take the
Yeah.
colors as seriously as Jodorowsky does. And yeah, it's and that's again, we were talking at the beginning, the different sort of schools of thought. Alejandro Jodorowsky is like his whole own discipline. That's like, you know, jujitsu. He's
Oh,
doing
wow.
Rider Waite Smith is Tai Chi or something. You know,
Yeah.
they're different schools. But the end result is, you know, similar. What you're trying to do is the same.
Definitely. No, I haven't looked into the Jodorowsky thing extensively, but I do want to. I was going to ask on just a very basic technical question, what deck,
Mhm.
obviously I know, and you can see this on your site, that
Mhm.
the weight deck is sort of your main deck, but the card that you sent me with House of Sleep was from the Hermetic deck, which I also
Mhm.
enjoy a lot. I kind of see it as a midway step between the weight deck and the Thoth deck, which is interesting to me.
Mhm.
But what decks do you have? Which ones do you
Yeah.
use? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I use the Rider Waite. I have the Hermetic deck, which I was using mostly as bookmarks. So I have like some, I don't know, half a deck left or something. And then I have Crowley's deck. I have Oh shoot, I have 6 or 7 different decks. I have one that somebody gave me that's all different flowers and plants. So every
Hmm.
card is its own flower and plant. I think it's the Botanical Tarot, which the art is beautiful. I don't
Yeah.
really use it to read, but every once in a while I'll take that out and I'll look at it. Um, I have one done by I'm blanking on his name. There's a Edward Gorey. It's like
Oh,
Edward
yeah.
Gorey art.
Nice. Did he
Um,
make that, or did someone make it with
I
his
think
art?
somebody else made that with
Yeah,
his art, is my
yeah,
understanding. I could have that wrong. And then I have a handful of sort of bespoke decks that somebody has come up with and sold some small limited run of that
right.
are
There's
kind
a
of
lot of
cool
those.
just as collector's items. I'm you know, there's so many. I try not to be dismissive of people trying to make new decks, you know, then there's some really cool ones. There is a aspect of me that when I see somebody making a new deck, I'm like, you know, the old deck is pretty good. You don't like we don't
Yeah, no, I kind of
necessarily need
feel
that new deck.
similarly about it.
Yeah.
One thing that I've done, I'm curious if you've ever delved into this, but one thing I've done for my own education, is if you get just like a random deck of playing cards, maybe cheaply,
Mhm.
it's kind of fun to go through and write your own attributions. Now, this is
Yeah, I saw
actually,
you were doing that. That's neat.
yeah,
That's a cool, I feel like that's a cool practice and it's helpful probably for this sort of memory palancing thing, but it's also like going to force you to think at
forces you to
another
think about
angle
it.
on this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool
Yeah, the way
idea.
that I've often done is kind of just like look at the weight card and almost write like the first thought that comes to your head on the equivalence. And for people who don't know tarot, it's worth mentioning that the modern playing card is a development upon the older tarot
Mhm.
deck.
Mhm.
They don't have any trumps except Joker's cards,
Right.
which are the same as the Fool, which is the first trump.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and you have one fewer card in the court as well.
Right. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. That could, well, even within different tarot decks, the court cards kind of change. Like the
Mhm.
Crowley's is different than Waite's, etc. But yeah, so you
Mhm.
have obviously Ace, King, Queen, Jack in a regular playing card deck. The Waite deck is Page, Knight, King, Queen, right? And
Right.
then
Right.
in Crowley's deck, it's Prince, Princess, Knight, Queen, no King. But
No,
yeah, so
yeah.
there's some variation on the court cards as well. But crucially, the small cards correspond, and
Hmm.
spades. The names of the suits change, but spades are swords, clubs
Hmm.
are wands, diamonds are pentacles, hearts are cups,
Hmm.
and that was another thing. Kind of early on after getting my first deck, that was like, oh, this actually, I saw more correspondence with what I was already familiar with,
Yeah,
which
and it is
that's
interesting when everybody grows up playing cards to some extent, right? It's familiar with the deck, and then you get into the tarot, and you're like, oh, yeah, this is the same. Like it's somehow structured the same.
yeah, and it
Yeah,
makes you
it's
look at cards differently. But no,
for
I've been
sure.
enjoying kind of making my own decks with sharpies and regular.
That's pretty cool. I like
Yeah.
it.
Along with the question on what decks you use, what sort of spreads are you into in terms of reading for yourself or others, etc.
Yeah, yeah. So I do a couple of different ones. Because I do occasionally do tarot readings sort of, commercially.
Yeah.
And for people online, you can reach out to me and we'll set something up.
Yeah.
I will do a 3 card spread, which I call beginning, middle, end spread. Or some people would be more or less identical to a past, present, future spread. Um, and I do a sort of stripped down version of the Celtic cross. The Celtic cross traditionally has a staff of cards, 4 or 5 on the right.
Yeah.
I don't do that. And not because I don't think it's useful or correct. I found in reading for other people that people's eyes start to kind of glaze over once you start getting there. It's you're
Hmm.
starting to strain people's attention spans. And so I focused on the central 6 cards in the Celtic cross instead, and I found that to be able to do anything I want it to do, more or less. And for people who don't know, basically what you've got there is your first card is what I would call the crux. It's basically the central issue or central answer or obstacle of whatever the querent is asking about. Then you have a card you lay on top of that, which is basically going to facilitate the process identified by the crux, or it's something that's in the way. And then underneath you have unconscious or subconscious underlying contributors to this thing. Up top, above the crossed cards, you'd have the conscious aspect of it, this something like a goal or a fear, something like that, that's sort of present of mind. And then you have a past and a future card. Excuse me, a past and a future card on either side of the cross. Um, Sometimes in a reading too, I will sort of zoom in on a card. So one card that
Mm-hmm.
maybe just doesn't make
Stands out.
sense or it's
Yeah.
super resonant for some reason, we kind of take that out of the spread and add 2 cards to it to make a, a, a beginning, middle, end reading out of it.
Oh, yeah, I've kind of done similar things to that
Yeah.
too. I sometimes
Yeah.
feel like I'm being sort of neurotic doing that, but like sometimes, yeah, it's like you just need a little
Yeah, it's
more
just
clarity.
yeah,
Yeah.
just more you're going to spend more time with it and understand a little bit more about it. I also will sometimes use, and this is more for to facilitate the creative writing process. I will do something like a hero's journey reading, which is it's basically, what is it, 5 cards. So you have call to adventure, cross the threshold, enemies and allies, the ordeal, and the return.
Hmm.
And it's a sort of a narrative that you're able to get out of these 5 cards. And I found that I don't really do that for other people. Usually I'll do it for myself sometimes and as an aid to the writing
So
process.
sometimes you actually allow that to influence where you go with a novel as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, tarot and writing, they actually go together really well. So
Yeah, no,
so
I
any
find I
Mhm.
find the same.
Mhm.
Not just in terms of what you mentioned, which is, you could even use it to outline, but
Yeah,
also
yeah.
just one thing I always do say to people who are kind of dubious about tarot and some of these other esoteric topics, it's like, um I don't know, to what extent this could or couldn't influence your life, but what I can say, and even my own, it's like,
Mhm.
how much has this, what readings have come true, quote unquote,
Mhm.
still kind of living in that. But definitely I find that the sort of processes, the psychological dimensions, you mentioned Jung, The process that seems to be described by the tarot and by the Tree of Life to an extent as well, for me closely mirrors the creative process,
Mm-hmm.
which makes sense because it's the Tree of Life, and then by extension the tarot as a extension of it is supposed to be this sort of guide, is supposed to be this mirror of God's emanations of light and creation. So it makes sense that if you are a creative person, that
Yeah,
that
you
there may
sort of
be.
you can
Yeah.
use those shapes. You can use for me, what I find in like the writing process is, um, I've really only worked on two novels since I really got into the tarot, and one thing is, um, each of them, and I think for the rest of my writing career, they focus basically the events of the novel could be distilled down into three or four cards in a row in the major arcana.
Hmm.
Right. And so
Oh,
it's the
interesting.
process it's the process in a very not obvious way.
Yeah.
If you weren't looking for it, I don't think you'd recognize it. But to me, what's happening is Wheel of Fortune into justice, into the Hanged Man, into death. That's what's going
Yeah.
on in the novel. Yeah.
Wow. No, I will think about that with regard to my own
Yeah.
writing. One sort of lingering question that I had from the episode on Burroughs we did, and it's not really directly about Burroughs. I'm just more using him as I guess, an example of something, or a way into the conversation. Um, we talked about how Burroughs had a very charmed worldview. Actually, I think that's an understatement.
Mhm.
I think he said somewhere that he pretty much believed that every little thing, happened, not just happened for a reason, but more specifically, and at times much more maliciously than that. He believed that everything happened in line with some will or other, some person's will, some deity's will. We see with his life, as we talked about, and as you and Kevin talked about on your original episode with Burroughs, that he actually saw himself as being in battle with some great dark force in his life. He thought everything happened in
Mhm.
line with will. There was pretty much no room at all for chance or randomness in his view of things. Most of us don't go quite this far, but we do notice synchronicities.
Yeah.
And the tarot deck, in reading tarot, is basically the art of synchronicity, or when you're looking at the cards, you're assuming a certain meaningful synchronicity. And I guess it's kind of an annoying question. I'm kind of almost asking you, like, well, how does tarot work, or like, and I think
Uh-huh.
that the point is often, and this is definitely the case for me, is not to be super explicit about it. It's not like,
Mhm.
yes, I believe synchronicity works in X, Y, and Z ways because God influences things in this way, and this angel influences the things in this way. But
Mhm.
I kind of dodged the question myself. And we kind of
Yeah.
talked about this earlier. It's like, it's not really a question of what literally is happening on a spiritual dimension. It's much more of a question of what is kind of working here or not for the
Yeah.
creative process, for the life process. So that's
Yeah.
my caveat. But I am curious, like, do you have a belief in a sort of higher realm, that thing, as above
Yeah.
so below, things manifest there first, and how does that influence tarot, or are you more agnostic?
Yeah, I definitely think there is an above, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Is that's probably just a limitation of human language to use the word above. But yeah, I certainly believe in an above. I certainly believe there are sort of planes of experience or reality, I guess, that are generally inaccessible in the day-to-day life, but
Mm-hmm.
can be accessed. Um, uh, and I think that not only the tarot, but any number of random slash aesthetic things things
Yeah.
is such a it
Mm-hmm.
are can be portals into that realm, can allow you a peek into what is occurring in that other realm. And there's other ways to do it too. I mean, I take people who've had religious visions, I take them at their word. um
Yeah.
and what bearing those have on the details of actual cosmology, I'm not sure that any human is actually capable of really even understanding. Everything has to be watered down for us. Like
Yeah.
we can only handle so much. Um, every even the most sophisticated conception of what's actually happening is still the children's illustrated Bible version of what's really going on. And so yeah, I do think there is some other realm. I do think that whatever is occurring there has a bearing here, has correspondences here, emanates down into our lived experience and our reality. When it comes to the tarot, though, I definitely have given readings to some very rational minded people. I mean, a friend of mine who was for a long time was a professor at MIT.
Hmm.
I don't think he was a full professor, but he taught at MIT, right?
Yeah.
And I've given him tarot readings, and I've sort of explained to him, like, because he doesn't buy any of that gobbledygook, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I've sort of explained to him, like, well, just all this is, think of it as a trick to get a look at yourself from a different angle than you're capable of, right?
Yeah.
It's this is what we're doing. We're trying to sort of perturbate your conception of yourself enough that you can see yourself in a different way. And I think it
Yeah.
does work on that very like psychological, almost game level,
Yeah.
for sure. But I also think that I don't totally believe in I sort of don't believe in randomness. I sort of don't
Yeah.
think things are actually random. And so anytime you take a system that is purportedly random, like shuffling cards, and then you present it, um, I think you're capturing, like tuning in to a radio signal. You're capturing some broadcast that is out there. And the random nature of it is what I think of. Um, this might be a far field
That's
analogy,
okay. Yeah.
but I remember for a while, and I wasn't sort of inherently interested in it, but I went on some ghost hunts for to write a piece
Yeah.
about them. And one thing they did is they had this like radio tuner that would very rapidly cycle through frequencies. And what would happen is, quote unquote, the ghost would speak
Hmm.
through that
Yeah.
randomness, and
Yeah.
words would pop out. And I have to admit, sitting there listening to it, words popped out that you were like,
Yeah.
that, if this was actually random, that would not have happened.
Yeah.
And I think of the tarot a little bit like that.
Right. Or like with automatic writing or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're making a randomness, and therefore it's allowing you to see patterns, that you
Yeah.
could see if you were trying to, right? If you were trying to articulate them, you would fail, but by the random nature of them allows you to see something.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, no, I think about that with automatic writing and tarot, and one to bring Burroughs into it,
Hmm.
just briefly, his cut up technique I think is
Hmm.
kind of like tarot in that sense, where
It is, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I absolutely think that's what he's doing. I mean, I'd find that stuff kind of unreadable, but I do think as a magical
Right,
practice, what
exactly.
he's doing is like, yeah, we're gonna, you think of like in a movie when a character is invisible, where they throw some flour in the air, and it's like, oh, there it is, sort of like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, where they throw the flower and then like the outline comes out.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, that I think that's how I think about it too. And maybe the slightly more readable version is what you were talking about, the sort of hero's journey reading earlier, because
Mhm.
if you're really delving into something like cut up technique, even automatic writing of other forms to an extent, like you are going to get something that's more random, but the tarot has logic more deeply imbued in it, and
Right,
you
right.
can kind of extract that. Um,
Hmm.
Sort of tangentially related to that, I was going to ask you about some kind of like do's and don'ts of
Mm.
tarot reading. And I'll explain what I mean by that, kind of with my own anecdote. One pitfall that I will sometimes fall into the cards, and you kind of brought this up. I think you can do this to a certain extent. You brought up earlier where you gain if you're doing a reading, you can kind of gain a little more clarity on a card that stands out. I think sometimes pulling more cards is okay, but
Hmm.
especially early days, I fall into a trap of consulting tarot too much, or
Hmm.
like if I pull three cards and then I'll like pull another three cards, I'll just keep stacking cards looking for something. And sometimes in the worst of cases, I'm what I'm doing is looking to affirm some preconceived notion.
Right.
So,
Yes.
and this is human nature. But it's something I've been thinking about recently. Again, on this kind of presentation I went to in LA recently on tarot, it was kind of eye opening for me about this. It was a very simple sort of ethical lesson of not letting your ego get in the way, but
Mm,
nevertheless, it was very helpful for me to hear it. I think the important thing with tarot, and I think probably with these other types of automatic writing and tapping into that randomness that you're talking about, I think the important thing is to let the thing speak itself, and that can be
mhm.
very hard with tarot when you're trying to project readings. It's a
Yeah.
pitfall I've fallen into and that I'm trying to kind of work away from, is to really just, and I think for me at a certain point it was because I do this random, I do this different tarot card every day on TikTok. I play with the deck a lot, like I have it
Mhm.
around all the time, and I don't necessarily want, because I'm trying to learn about it. But I think that one can over ask very specific questions, and that sometimes there is a lot more power in just letting the cards speak. So
Yeah.
two-pronged question for you. One,
Sure.
if you kind of, if that notion of pitfalls of the kind of more egoic way of reading resonates, and two, I think I remember you told me you only do like one reading for yourself, or you get one reading from someone else like
Mm.
once per season. Are you kind of limited? I guess let's start with that
Yeah.
question. We'll get into the other
Sure.
topics. Are
Yeah.
you kind
Yeah.
of limited in how often you actually really get a reading for yourself? And
Yeah, yeah, I don't give myself and I similarly when I was in early stages, like sort of not to say that I have some degree of mastery, but there was a time when I didn't know what any of the cards meant,
yeah,
right? And at that time it was very, I remember being very, obsessive, and and now it's a little more like, yeah, I give myself a reading about every 3 or 4 months. And the question is usually more or less the same. It's fairly open-ended. I tend to avoid specifics when it comes to me giving myself a reading. And 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 yet at the same time, I'm oh I am constantly thinking, maybe constantly is a stretch, but very frequently thinking about, because I believe that the major arcana is the story of your life.
yeah,
And you are um it is in some sense linear, in that generally what will happen is you'll be in the position of one card and you will move into the next card sequentially, but you regress all the time in different aspects of your
yeah.
relationships. You might be at one and
Well, I remember,
you're
just if I could just butt in with
yeah,
one thing from your
yeah,
writing, you
yeah,
said you'll with regard to the major arcana, I think you wrote, I don't even remember which card this was, but you wrote,
yeah.
you're going to revisit these things 1,000 times before you die, which I think is
Hmm.
very
Yeah.
resonant. Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. And that's genuinely how I feel. And like, for instance, I mean, your job or your work life, your earth, your pentacle,
yeah,
you might be very far advanced, and for whatever reason the relationship aspect has regressed or withered or never developed or whatever. And intellectually you could be a total neophyte, and yet creatively and intuitively, advanced, or whatever. So you're all over the place. But I do tend to think, excuse me, pretty regularly about where I am at in the major arcana, and what is to be learned at in that chapter. What am I trying to get? How, in what way am I moving into the next phase? Whatever the next card is. And so that's like a constant reading, like, almost,
yeah,
right, but
yeah,
very slow. And so I'm in one right now, and I think about it, what that means to be in that one, what the next one would be. And so in a way, that kind of reading's happening a lot. um
yeah,
for other people, um one thing I would say for people who are, if you're like learning about it or you're trying to give yourself readings, I tend to shy away from the like predicting the future stuff.
yes,
I don't think it's that interesting. I mean, it is in a way, of course. If you could like predict sports scores or something like in Back to the Future, that'd be great. But so for people who are trying to learn how to do this, my don't that I would have in that regard is like, don't try to use this to figure out what's going to happen. Use it to try and figure out maybe something closer to like what you should do, right?
Yeah.
Rather than, or how you should be, or how you should look at the situation, rather than what is the next thing that's going to happen. I mean, I like to focus. I don't, maybe this is an American thing. I don't want to give up agency ever, really.
Yeah.
And so I don't want it to be like, well, what's going to happen to me? It's much more, I'm more of the like pray for the strength, not for the thing to go well kind of person.
Yeah, no, same,
Yeah.
same.
Yeah. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, so for me the tarot is much more about like which do I have blind spots in how I'm approaching this thing, and can it help me see that? Um yeah, so and the when I do readings for other people, I really, this kind of egoic thing you talk about definitely factors in, and I've told people this, you know, I've told them to think about a question, and sometimes they start to try and tell me, and I don't want to know their question.
Yeah.
and 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 I tell them it's like, it's not that I don't care. And when all the cards are on the table and I've said some things, we if you want, you can share your question with me. But what I'm trying to be careful about is, if I know the question, I can very easily fall into giving advice. And then what's happening is the person is basically asking me to answer their question. And what I'm trying to do is facilitate a sequence of symbols that's going to help them answer the question, right? And
Exactly.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, and so
It's
if
a
I don't
tricky
know
thing.
their
Yeah.
question, it takes me out of the ability to try to answer their question specifically. Yeah, so
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's just been one of my big. Again, it feels like it shouldn't be this big insight because it's very obvious when you think about it how tricky the ego can be. But hey, these are tarot cards. Like they
mhm.
have often been used for fortune telling
Yeah,
in a much more vulgar sense, and again, not always to even diss that. I think again, there's an entertainment value to that. Um,
sure.
and I don't, and also I think
And I think
sometimes that stuff
some
happens to be
people
true. Yeah.
some people might be psychic, like literally might be able to tell the future. I don't know. I can't.
Yeah, I don't think I
Yeah.
can either. And
Yeah.
so anyway, it feels like it should obviously these sort of more egoic ways of dealing with the cards, or even when you're dealing with other people, you keep it's important, and this is a lesson in the deck itself that we're talking about earlier with the swords versus the wands and everything. It's important to realize that there's dimensions to the cards and the way they're going to behave that is
Mhm.
beyond if you're focused on explicit question and answering explicit question in an explicit way, that's kind of one dimensional versus
Mhm.
something that can be four or more dimensional, because there's I say four because of the
Yeah.
four different elements that you're kind of keeping it on that swords level almost. You know what I mean? You're keeping
Mhm.
it in a very literal minded level
Yeah.
when you're just asking questions and looking for literal answers, but there's all kinds of there's a rich amount of other things that can come up. And I mean, I like kind of what you're saying. You don't even want to hear the question of the querent, which I think makes sense. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think I'm trying to move away. I think when you first get a toy or anything like that, you kind of want to see what it can do, right? And I think that when I this first year or so of me playing with tarot, um obviously I'm going to try and predict the future here and there, and I'm going to try and ask very explicit questions. But I think where I'm headed to now is like really saying no to that,
Mhm.
letting the cards speak for themselves, and maybe later factoring some of that back in, because I do think it can all
Sure.
be synthesized. It's just, as with anything else in life, it's a question of balance and kind of disciplining yourself so you know when to do things one way and when to do them
Yeah.
another. And the whole asking questions thing can certainly
Yeah.
be overdone. But yeah.
Yeah. A couple other sort of things along this line. One thing I would tell people too, and I have told people, is don't it's tricky because I've had conversations with people where I'm sort of trying to convince them how powerful this thing is, and then at the same time I'm sort of like, don't expect miracles. Like, don't expect it to don't expect the word of God to enter your mind by doing this. It's subtler than that, and
Yeah.
it requires you to look outside the cards often too. um And then another thing that I will tell people too is when you're throwing cards, oftentimes, if you have a question in mind, and I like to have a question in mind if I'm actually going to throw cards for myself, it's something I'm sort of focusing on. And, oftentimes the response of the deck will be more of a interrogation of why you asked that question to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like an example, just kind of off the top of my head, somebody might sort of be asking a relationship question and kind of coming at it with a certain degree of anxiety and neuroses. And the deck is basically just sort of like throwing back at you, like, um, you should look at the reason why you're asking that question, why that's in front of your mind, why does this bother you so much. That's where sometimes that's what the card will actually deal with rather than trying to answer your question.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of a trick that it will pull on you. so
Huh.
so I would say be open to that, be open to the fact that maybe what's being investigated is the roots of your question rather than something like an answer to it.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Um, I'm feeling like I have this other quote from one of your writings that I wanted
Okay.
to pull
Sure.
out. I'm not sure how relevant it is to the immediately foregoing conversation, but I don't know. It feels like maybe it's the time.
Okay.
Again, I don't exactly remember which one I pulled this from, but I like it. No, the Five of Wands is what I pulled.
Oh, okay.
And I like what you said about Jung. You're right. Jung said a million worthwhile things I plan to one day understand. Aside, I completely agree. But one I think I get is that enlightenment comes when all your wands work together. And if he didn't, he should have. I guess that's Jung. If
Yeah.
Jung didn't say that, he should have.
Yeah.
If you bring for this is what I like. This is one of the reasons I like it. We can unpack this more. If you bring forth what is unconscious, you will know it to be part of you instead of thinking the place it steers you toward is fate.
Hmm.
The card tells us this as clearly as a well-loved teacher. I think maybe that is actually relevant to what we were talking about just now a bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think this is this concept that you're trying to bring the unconscious and make it conscious. And
yeah.
you that's what Jung describes basically, and there's more to it, but if you're going to boil it down, that's what he would describe as enlightenment. And
Hmm.
so
Or
that is part
individuation, right? But yeah,
is individuation. Yeah.
same thing,
Yeah.
same thing. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And that's part of what I think the tarot allows you to do. This whole thing we were talking before is like we're going to just try and break your conception for a second so you can see yourself from a different angle. That's what's happening. Trying to get, and you'll see this. I mean, this is often what they're trying to do in psychotherapy too, is just like get this so you can actually see it so that your behavior makes sense to you actually, because if you don't interrogate it, it very rarely will make sense. Why do I do that all the time?
exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
it turns out that it's part of this pattern that you can trace back to um and and so that's one of the things that I think the tarot is, when you're using it, it allows you to do. It allows you to bring the unconscious into the conscious and allows you to get your wands lined up. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, kind of. And there's for me, there's also, and this is what I'm dealing with when I'm writing about these Crowley cards that I was supposed to write about on Monday, and that I'm still writing about now. Um, the process of alchemy, which Jung was also very interested in, is this process of and not my understanding of this is incredibly cursory, but I'm not most going to go for it. This process of bringing different elements together to create the Philosopher's Stone, through the great work, the magnum opus. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that line about your wands aligning, your different wands, your different drives, shall we say, in sort of Nietzschean or psychoanalytic parlance. If you can kind of synthesize these different forces within yourself, you will come back with magic, with the Philosopher's Stone, is
Mm-hmm.
something that's been speaking about. Another question. So I'm glad just this is definitely a great pull-out quote. I think it gets to
Yeah.
something very deep level about tarot, and one can see also its relation to something like Jungian psychoanalysis. Just kind of as an aside, again, my friend Meme Analysis, who I've done this podcast with, he's a very brilliant guy, and I
Mm-hmm.
asked him, because he's very into occult stuff, but also very into Jung and Freud actually too, and
Mm-hmm.
psychoanalysis in general. And I asked him, like, do you think the occult stuff, and do you see the occult stuff and psychoanalysis as basically the same thing at the end of the day? And he said yes, like it is kind of the same discipline, different angles on the same thing, different approaches. One is obviously there's kind of a therapeutic approach in psychoanalysis, and in tarot and in magic and other occult stuff, it's often a little more pragmatic, like what can I do with this? But nevertheless, it's kind of approaching that same phenomenon, which is, you could call it the unconscious. That obviously is to give it a more psychoanalytic slant, but it's the general phenomenon is the same object of study in both.
I would agree with that. Yeah, for sure. And I'm always looking for these correspondences. This is partially like what I'm doing in some of these tarot pieces I'm writing, is like looking for what's inherent in this card. How does that correspond to something from the psychoanalytical world, scientific world, wherever I can find another way of looking at it, right? Another way of articulating an analogy. I mean, I think analogies are like essentially magic. So if you can find a good one, you've got a powerful tool.
Exactly. I was even talking recently about how etymologies can almost be magic. These roots of meaning that are in our day-to-day parlance that we don't even necessarily think about. The meaning that there is, like the etymology of the word magic is the same etymology that's in a word like magnitude or magnum or majesty. It's all about greatness. So we think of magic as sort of like tricks and things like that. But in its root, it's about channeling that greatness, which again, see it in Kabbalah a little bit. But it's like that on a deep level just by your usage of the word, but you don't always know that it becomes this intuitive thing because the origins of things are forgotten. Right, but I think looking into etymology, looking into analogies, engaging in psychoanalysis, and of course using the tarot can be these processes of getting back in touch with the roots of meaning. And I think that is a magical process.
Yeah, 100%. Very well put.
If the last thing on the quote, your quote about Jung and the Five of Wands and bringing your wands into alignment, were you, when you wrote, if you bring forth what is unconscious, you will know it to be part of you, instead of thinking the places it steers you toward is fate, were you thinking of, just out of curiosity, were you at all thinking of the Gospel of Thomas? Line,
yes.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, the thing that I wrote there is basically a rewriting of something that Jung said, and yes, it does show up in the Gospel of Thomas, which is basically like, and I'm not going to have the quote, but
I have the quote in front of me, so I'll read it.
Okay, great.
But
great.
Go on. Though.
Yeah, great.
I'll read it
if you have it. Read it.
Yeah. I also will add that I use this as a what's the word? Why this is early hours for me. What's the word when you put a quote at the front of your book? Not a blurb, but
an epigraph.
Yes, epigraph. I use this as an epigraph for my first novel, Dragon Day. But the quote is, "If you bring forth what is," hold on a second. This is Jesus talking, mind you.
Right.
If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100%. And actually, the novel that I'm working on right now, the title as it stands, and maybe it'll change, is That Which Is Within, which is taken from, it's a slight change to the beginning of that quote.
Wild. Yeah.
So I totally believe that. And I have found in my own life that whenever I'm able to bring forth something that is buried deep in me, and usually what that really means is just articulating it. Like it's literally just being able to sort of identify it and name it and get your hands around it. You automatically, you understand yourself better. And you'll see in the Jungian sense that it was driving you in a direction and you just thought this was stuff happening to you. And then in the Gospel of Thomas sense, you'll see that like if you don't bring it out, it will just
It
rot
will
your
destroy you.
life.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, your
yeah.
unconscious will kill you. It
Hmm.
can. There's the. I mean, that's the kind of interesting delineation between fortune telling versus this kind of deeper level engagement with tarot we're talking about. I mean, the whole fortune telling. Maybe this is almost overly simplistic because a lot of us, I think, would like to think there is that divinatory potential in the tarot to, yeah, maybe tell the future in a truly mystical sense or in a
Right.
luminous sense. But there's also this sense in which it's like, well, yeah, the tarot is going to be able to tell your fortune if you're not in touch with yourself enough or something, right? Like
Hmm.
it's going to be like you can tell what people are going to do if you can see what's driving them, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah, exactly. So like you think you put it into an extreme example. It's sort of like somebody who has a serious drug or alcohol problem, right? Oh, can I predict their future?
Yeah,
Sort of.
yeah.
And part of the way that they can start to understand their future is by getting to the root of why that they do that, right? it's
Hmm.
and it's and
And
that's
then they can change their future. It's
and
not
then
set
they
in
can,
stone. Yeah,
right, exactly. And so in that sort of sense, it is kind of can be a form of fortune telling. This whole process can be a sort of form of fortune telling because you can see at least in a sense of a pattern where things will go.
absolutely. No, I think
Yeah.
that's pretty crucial.
Hmm.
Um, One thing I want to touch on before we wrap again, because we already talked about this, but I want to
Yeah.
highlight it again. It's of course remains relevant to what we're talking about now. As one of the things I kind of was on the tip of my tongue earlier, and I forgot it, but I really do, in your reflections on the tarot, the way that you really delve into the existential matters of your life and allow the cards to speak to that, and then very bravely open up about some of these issues
Yeah.
is very striking to me, and I think also this is a good illustration of the kind of the power of the cards to potentially influence one's life, but also see one's life in a different manner. I specifically wanted to highlight your reflection on the magician,
Mm-hmm.
the first trump called the juggler in Crowley's deck, but that's neither here nor there.
Hmm.
About kind of your decision to become a writer,
Hmm.
despite sort of the reasons why maybe at that point you wouldn't have become a writer, just
Sure. Yeah.
illustrating your own, taking your own agency as that card, I think is kind of a call to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the big difference. And it's, I had already had sort of the moment that I talk about in that piece. I mean, I was in a MFA program, right? Like I was sort of already I was pretty
Okay,
serious about
yeah,
things at the time, but still what I hadn't done yet is I didn't have a voice yet. Like
yeah,
I didn't understand. I didn't have any idea what my tools were. I didn't really, I may have thought that I did, but I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know I have any sense of what direction to go into. And so yeah, so this was about within already sort of being like I like to write,
yeah.
and I apparently have some level of capability at it
Hmm.
enough that I'm a little bit better than the average person, hopefully. But within that, then realizing like what is particular about me, what is sort of I don't, if I were to write a writing manifesto, what are the tenets of that thing for me, and why is that different from somebody else? Well, what's the point of, there's a lot of writers right
Yeah,
now, right? And you could just not do it, and the world would be more or less the same. So where are you gonna, what are you calling upon in order to, sort of push you forward and pull you forward into
yeah,
this thing? And and magician was important to me as a card to kind of encapsulate all of these things. I mean, he's really calling on the energies of the heavens, I suppose, right?
yeah.
And channeling them. I think the subtitle of that piece is "Focus the Lightning."
Right,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, which is kind of how I came to think about writing. Is it's not just for me. It's not just about clearly articulating very discrete ideas. there's something else occurring. And part of that process is letting yourself be a conduit, letting yourself be a
Absolutely.
lightning rod,
Yeah,
right?
open to some
Yeah.
higher
Hmm.
influence. Yeah, I was gonna excellently put, and I was gonna kind of ask in a sort of annoyingly quotidian sense, like,
That's all right.
at this point, when you're talking about this process of, and reflection on the magician and writing, I mean, were you into tarot at that time, or that's kind of a later?
No, I mean, I had started being familiar with it, but at that time, no, I wasn't really
I
I
see.
didn't have I didn't own a deck or anything. Like I hadn't read anything about it or anything. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you'd say, like, obviously the cards have affected the way that you look at your life and given you a rich vocabulary to talk about them. But have you ever, like, would you say, really been influenced by the cards in a more forward sense? Like, it's
Mhm.
whether from a reading or, yeah, I'm just curious
Yeah,
about that. Yeah.
yeah, sure. So every reading I've done for myself has had particular effects, but like there is a specific reading I did that if I had not done it, you and I wouldn't probably
Oh
be
man.
talking right now. I don't Yeah, I mean I had yeah, I mean this is what I do in the pieces on the tarot, so I might as well be sort of
Yeah,
vulnerable about it.
sure.
Um I had would be 7 years ago, 6 years ago now or so. I'd sort of hit a pretty low point in my life. I had after graduate school, I had wandered around. I'd lived on a couch
Yeah.
in Colorado for a while. Didn't really know what I was doing. Was teaching part time or tutoring really part time.
Hmm.
Uh, and then I had moved to upstate New York to work with a guy I'd formerly known, and the company I worked for basically went bankrupt while I was there, and
Sure.
uh,
Yeah.
I was in a insane relationship that was traumatic to be
Yeah.
pretty
I
to
think
be
you
quite
wrote a
honest.
bit about it. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
did, yeah, in another one of
Yeah.
these one of the more recent ones on the swords, I wrote about that. And sort of bottomed out, was living in somebody's basement way out in the country near Rochester, New York,
Yeah.
running out of money, didn't really know what to do, and I did a reading, literally like I need some help here. Like I don't know, I felt like I was making good decisions like along the way. They made sense to me when I made them, and somehow I ended up here, and I
Yeah.
was 35 or 34 or something. Like I was like, what the hell happened, and what do I do here?
Yeah. God.
And this reading was basically like, I don't want to put too fine of a point on it because it's going to sound ridiculous if I do to somebody who's not me. But basically, the point was what you need to do is focus all of these things. Like you already actually know what you want to do. And what you keep doing is you keep allowing yourself to be split off. And you keep sort of like, yeah, I want to do that, but I know I also kind of have to do this a little bit, and I kind of have to do that a little bit. And
Yeah.
instead, what you need to do is just bring it all to bear on this point.
Yeah.
Um, and I had that in conjunction around the same time with a uh with an ayahuasca experience
Yeah. Right.
in which I was told that as long as I worked hard and I told the truth, that I would be taken care of.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like everything's gonna work out, sweetie. It was basically like, Brad, if you show up every day, the world will show up every day. And
Yeah.
so
And I
just
think that is
don't
true.
ever give
Yeah.
up. And it
Yeah.
is true. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
lost sight of that somehow. I kept expecting things to happen somehow. Right.
Yeah.
So that reading was huge for me. I mean, I
No, that's
still distinctly
fantastic. Yeah.
remember it. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep, sitting on the floor of this basement. These people who were letting me stay with them because I was still paying rent on the house I lived in with this girl.
Oh, but you have to escape.
And
Yeah. God.
and was like, it was literally, I felt like it was like a handhold. I was in a pit, and I suddenly realized there was a ladder running up the side.
That's
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's funny. Not that this is here or there, but
yeah.
what was this, like, 2014, 2015?
Around there, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I
yeah.
was also in upstate New York around that time.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
because I went
yeah.
to Cornell. So anyway, that's just,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
I'm from Syracuse originally, so very familiar with the
Okay.
area.
Yeah.
I have a really neither here nor there, but I have a fondness for upstate New York being from it, but that also doesn't sound like the best place to hit rock bottom, especially if it
Well,
was winter, which I don't know if it
yeah,
was, but
yeah, and
yeah,
the other thing, I'm not from there, so
yeah,
I didn't really have a network of people there,
yeah, yeah,
and so I was sort of just by myself practically. I mean, I had a couple people who cared about me and who were concerned that I'd be all right, but like not, not a lot of opportunities.
yeah. Well, it seems like
Yeah,
things have
worked out okay. Yeah,
yeah, no, it's
yeah,
good, it's
yeah.
good.
So
Um,
it's all good.
no, that's good. All right, well, we are winding down here, and I don't
Mhm.
want to keep you longer if you need to go, but I mean, there's a few other
Sure,
kind of
yeah, let's
brief
do it.
things we could touch on. I guess first of all, you mentioned earlier you're eventually would like to do this whole deck, writing
Yeah.
about each card. But obviously that's going to take a while. But we are going to see more of these in the future. And kind of what's your process like for deciding when and where to do cards?
Yeah, like when to write about them
When
like
to
this?
write about them? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a couple that aren't on the website, and I've been sort of half-heartedly looking for somewhere else to publish them, just to
Hmm.
see if that is
I
a
mean, they're of
possibility.
that character. They're very well
Yeah,
written. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I appreciate that, and I think they could find a home somewhere, for sure. So like I said, I have a couple that are sort of in the chamber. Um, yeah, I at one point I was gonna just sit down and just somehow do them in order. I don't even know what that
Yeah.
would mean exactly. Because where do you, even if you're gonna do them quote in order, where do you start? Um,
Exactly.
and I wanted to save most of the major arcana for the end because I felt like what's gonna happen is I'm gonna learn so much by doing this that I will then be more capable of writing about the major arcana
Yeah.
cards because there's such depth to them. So I kind of pick them at random. Honestly, I would just like, okay,
I
I'm
mean,
gonna
that's what
write
I'm
about one,
doing. Yeah.
and I pick
Yeah.
one, and then write about them.
That's what I
Um,
thought because they have that rate. It's a small card here, major
yeah,
arcana here, no order. I mean, I think
yeah,
that is the right way to do with tarot.
it
When in
seems to
doubt,
be.
go with random.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
it wants to be random. That's it, and
it wants to be random.
yeah,
Yeah,
it works better when it's been randomized to some degree, I think. So yeah, that's kind of the thing. I've set it aside for a little bit
yeah,
because I'm really trying to get my novel done this year. Like
right.
this sort of top priority. So I've sort of set it aside. There's only so much time in the day, so that time now needs to be on the
Oh
novel.
no, I mean, I'm doing this now because I finished a couple projects and I've been
Hmm.
wanting to do it for a long time, but I don't think I'm going to get to the end before I have another project speak to me. So it'll
Hmm.
be also similar to you. I think the a project that spans, if not a lifetime, then at least in the initial round, it could be at least like a year of going back and forth. And then I think, as in the world card,
Hmm.
the last Trump, with the Ouroboros, I believe there's an Ouroboros on that.
Yeah,
Maybe not.
there's certainly a loop.
Anyhow,
Yeah.
when you get to the end, you're back at the beginning. I think that's
Hmm.
also in the nature of tarot, because I think the second I get to the end of this kind of more throw everything at the wall type of approach I'm taking the cards, I'm gonna be like, well, now it's time to do something more like what Brad did and like
Yeah,
really just
yeah.
reflect on my life. And I think that's a
Hmm.
kind of this never ending process.
Yeah, and then you can do that,
Yeah,
and then you find some other lens to look at it, right?
absolutely. And
Yeah.
it will change with every chapter of life as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
Is there anything you can tell us, not tarot related, but is there anything you can tell us about your novel? Or, I mean, if you're still
Sure.
working on it, perhaps say very little, but however we'd like
Yeah,
to go. Yeah,
no, it's pretty far along at this point.
yeah,
So, I worry talking about it too much early on because you kind of
of
spoiled
course.
it in
Yeah.
your head. Um, there's a chapter that's going to be coming out in the forthcoming Gaia horror special from Apocalypse
Oh,
Confidential, which
great.
I don't
Yeah.
know when this comes out, but that'll be out on April 22nd. So that's coming out. That's a chapter from That Which Was Within. Um, it's
I will check it out. Yeah.
yeah, it's a novel. It is the focuses on the main character is a disgraced academic who in the
Hmm.
world of anthropology and archaeology who has found himself dismissed, I guess we'll say, from the world of academia, and has through a series of circumstances has wound up working a very blue collar job inside the sewer working for a sewer rehabilitation crew. And while working on this crew, they encounter what would probably be best described as some kind of portal. And on the other side of this portal, they are in a sort of labyrinth in which every time they try to exit the sewer, they end up in some a different realm that has something to do with their own minds. So, and it's about these guys, and in specifically this former academic trying to find their way out of it. It's got a kind of adventure novel elements to it, I would say. But also, I'm also playing with some concepts that are interesting to me, and hopefully the goal is to make them interesting to other people. It's my Earth novel, so I've realized that I'm writing House of Sleep, which came out in 2021, is my water novel. This is my Earth novel. I will have, if I continue on this path, I'll have a swords, an air novel, and I'll have a fire novel.
I like that a lot. No, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Before we wrap, anything else you want to plug? Obviously, you're again one half of Art of Darkness pod.
Listen to Art of Darkness. We in-depth, for people who don't know, in-depth profiles on dead artists, focusing somewhat on the dark side of creativity. Recent episodes on Jorge Luis Borges, David Foster Wallace, Ernest Hemingway. Coming up, I'm in the process of, I was just watching Tarkovsky movie this morning. We're going to be doing an episode on Andrei Tarkovsky, the director behind Stalker and Solaris and a number of other amazing films. So keep an eye out for that. They're a lot. There are multiple hours. We go deep on them, and if you listen to an episode, you'll walk away knowing their life story and why they're important.
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal podcast. And again,
thank you.
Plugged it elsewhere, but I will plug it here. I mean, it's Kevin, your co-host, calls it an effort pod a lot, and that's a good way of thinking about it. Obviously, there's a lot of podcasts that are sort of more banter, maybe they're funny, but I mean, Art of Darkness is a podcast that you can listen to, like the Great Courses series or something, where you're going to learn.
We're trying to we're sort of rogue academia is the way we think of it.
Yep. No, it's aspirational. I think on my podcast we also try and go in that direction, but I don't know if we bring quite the level of scholarship. What you guys do is fantastic.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, absolutely.
That's
That's all I've got to promote. Yeah. Brad Kelly, ESQUE.com, Twitter at Brad Kelly.
Yep. People will know where to find you. And thank you so much.
Of course, this was awesome, man.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed this a lot. I'm going to stop recording.